Hi, I'm Blair from Newlane University, and I'll be talking about this objective anticipate readers' need for information, explanation, and context in philosophical writing. And if I were to kind of put an overarching theme behind all three of these, it's really that in philosophical writing, you want to be carefully taking your reader by the hand through your argument leading up to your conclusion, your thesis. So, and each of these play a different part, though they're all related. And that kind of image of I'm carefully walking through my reader to my thinking and how this argument proceeds to the conclusion. So for information, it could be, what is it that we're talking about here? What is the argument that we're making? So if I'm talking about Descartes' argument, for example, that ends with the conclusion, I think, therefore I am, then I'm going to be setting this up and saying, okay, we're going to be talking about Descartes' argument and how he moved from his different premises, how he learned to doubt his senses and doubt other sources for so-called knowledge, up until he came to his conclusion that he deemed was indubitable. So that's information. It's also context. And kind of the difference between information and context will depend on what your thesis is, what you're trying to argue for. When we're talking about information, again, this is going to be driven by the argument that you're making. So some information may be applicable to your argument that wouldn't be applicable in another argument. So for example, again, if I'm talking about Descartes, there's all sorts of information about Descartes, but what information is especially important or applicable for your argument? So for example, I could say, here's where Descartes was born. Here's where he lived. Descartes studied at certain times at these places, and Descartes wrote this book and that book. This is all information about Descartes, but a lot of that is probably not going to be relevant to my argument. So the information is, when anticipating my reader's need for information, I want to be clear and say, hey, I'm talking about Descartes and I'm talking about his argument, and this is what is important about, here's some information that is going to be important, that's going to inform how you can follow my argument. So again, we don't need to list every little detail about Descartes or every little turn Descartes makes in his argument. We're going to focus on those parts that are important for my argument, for your argument. So that's what, so your thesis, your argument, that is going to drive what is information versus what is kind of irrelevant stuff, and what needs explication and what doesn't need explication because it's out of the scope of what you're doing, and what context is important, whether that's the historical, social, philosophical context, or the context of your argument, where you are in your argument. So when we're talking about information, what we're really saying is, hey, here's what we're talking about. And you want to say it in as clear and succinct a way you can so that your reader isn't going to be confused. So you're saying, hey, here's where we are, here's what we're talking about. Explication is really explaining what you're saying. And this could be explaining passages that you're drawing from. If you, to go back to the Descartes example, if I'm going to be using some passage from Descartes, I'll use that passage, I'll explain what Descartes means or how I'm interpreting Descartes, what I'm interpreting Descartes as saying, and making it clear, trying to make it as clear as I can for the reader how I'm interpreting this, how I'm treating this passage. I'm also, in explicating, I'm also trying to explain where we are in the argument. So I'm explaining, okay, here is this premise, and this is what this premise is about, this is what it's saying, and here we're working toward this conclusion, and I'm explaining all the way along, so there's no doubt or there's no place where the reader is kind of lost, or the reader is kind of going, wait, how did we switch from what you were saying earlier to where we are here? And this also gets to context. Now, context can be at least two different ways of treating context. So one context is just, well, what was the setting? What was the environment, the social environment, the philosophical environment, the historical environment at the time that, for example, Descartes was writing this? What stands out in that context that is going to help the reader understand what I'm doing with this argument? And the other part of context is, where are we in terms of my argument? So often, as you're writing a philosophical paper, you'll often make call outs to the reader. So you can say something like, as we've already settled earlier with this premise, that Descartes discovered that his senses were no longer reliable for knowledge, and that's settled. We're now moving to this next premise where we're going to be talking about how Descartes found other knowledge, so-called knowledge that he had obtained, not through his senses, but through other means, was also unreliable. So the context, how I'm using context here is to make it clear to the reader, where are we in the context of this argument, your argument that you're making? Where are we? Are we at a premise? Are we in the middle of a premise? Have we moved on to another premise? Are we connecting those premises? Are we now at the conclusion? Are we strengthening the connection between the premises and the conclusion? And overall, what we're doing is, again, holding our reader's hand to make sure that they're not going to be distracted, they're not going to lose their way, that they're with us the whole way through the argument. Each of these terms anticipate the reader's need for information, explication, and context. Each of these terms has a meaning. Information I'm kind of, again, using as, what are we talking about? Explication as, let me explain what this part of the argument is, or let me explain what this passage means. And context is, okay, what was the situation like when this philosopher was writing this? Or where are we in the terms of the argument? But all three, again, are all three fall under the umbrella of, you're carefully walking through your reader through your argument. You're carefully walking your reader through your argument to reach your conclusion. And by the time you get to the conclusion, what you want from your reader is for your reader to see, oh, of course, this makes perfect sense. I felt I was with you the whole way, and there were no distractions, there were no major departures. It was all a clear, careful hike from premises to conclusion. And that's what you're trying to do with this sort of standard in philosophical writing.